Is democracy founded on reason? Part 7. By James P. Pierce. Democracy, Political Power, and God's Will. We must begin by exploring the tension between secular governance and the Christian theological understanding of authority, particularly within Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. The broader critique revolves around democracy's potential pitfalls and the contrast between human will and divine will, as well as the role of oligarchy in governance. Democracy, will of the people or of the rulers. The term democracy, as this is rightly mentioned, derives from the Greek words demos, people, and kratos, power or rule. In theory, democracy is supposed to embody the rule of the people, but to highlight a common critique, that those in power often govern in their own interests rather than reflecting the will of the people. In practical terms, many argue that democracies frequently evolve into oligarchies, where a few elites exert significant influence, often against the greater good or the moral order. This tension raises a fundamental question: can true democracy exist if those in power are tempted by greed, corruption, and self-interest? From a Christian standpoint, governance, like all of human life, should ideally be subject to divine order and aligned with God's will. In Catholic and Orthodox Christian traditions, this question intersects with the belief that human authority must be rooted in the moral teachings of God. Without this foundation, governance becomes susceptible to moral decay, as it reflects fallen human nature rather than divine justice. God's covenant and the role of governance. From a Christian perspective, as found in both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, all authority ultimately comes from God. This is expressed in Romans 13:1, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." For Christians, rulers, whether in democracies, monarchies, or other systems, are supposed to act as stewards of God's justice and order. However, human sinfulness, self-interest, and the temptation of power frequently distort this divine ideal. As it is suggested, when governance is detached from the will of God, it opens the door for rule based on human ambition rather than divine justice. This can lead to the degradation of society's moral compass, particularly in cases where secular ideologies or movements such as the promotion of certain sexual ethics or identity politics are elevated above traditional Christian values. Christian monarchism vs. democratic revolutions. In the context of Christian monarchism, many historical monarchs in Europe claimed to rule by divine right, meaning they saw their authority as given directly by God. Catholic and Orthodox monarchies were often intertwined with religious institutions, believing that Christian kingship reflected a hierarchical order that mirrored God's rule over the universe. Monarchs were seen as guardians of the faith and protectors of the moral order, with the Church as a central partner in guiding the nation. For example, Tsarist Russia, grounded in Eastern Orthodoxy, saw the monarch as the defender of the faith and protector of orthodoxy. In Catholic Europe, monarchs like Charlemagne were crowned by the Pope, symbolizing the unity between church and state. However, democratic revolutions, such as the French and American revolutions, directly challenged this traditional model of governance. The French Revolution explicitly sought to replace the monarchy with the will of the people, rejecting both the divine right of kings and the influence of the Church in governance. This secularization of power directly contradicted the hierarchical model that had long been upheld by Catholic and Orthodox monarchies. The American Revolution, while influenced by Enlightenment ideas and the notion of liberty, was less overtly anti-Christian but still centered on human reason and individual rights, which were seen as derived from the people rather than divine authority. The Christian view on power and governance. In Christian thought, power is a responsibility entrusted by God, not something to be wielded for personal gain. In the Catholic Church, for instance, the Pope and bishops are seen as servants who act as stewards of the Church's spiritual and moral leadership. The idea of a servant leader echoes Christ's teaching that whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, Matthew 20:26. Power, in this sense, is exercised in service to God and the community, not for self-aggrandizement. Orthodox Christianity also holds to a similar ideal, emphasizing symphonia, harmony, between church and state. Ideally, this means that both the church and political authority work together in service to the same higher divine purpose. However, even in Orthodox thought, when political leaders betray this responsibility, they risk losing their legitimacy. Democracy's challenges. To raise concerns about secular movements, such as modern identity politics and social justice ideologies, and their potential to undermine Christian values and reason. From a traditional Christian viewpoint, when societies stray from natural law, which is rooted in God's created order, they risk moral and spiritual decay. For example, in many contemporary secular democracies, there is increasing tension between Christian values and the progressive ideologies that promote secular humanist rights, and other social changes that are seen by traditional Christians as contrary to natural law and biblical teachings. Pope Benedict XVI once spoke of a dictatorship of relativism, where moral values become subject to individual or societal preference rather than objective truth rooted in God. This raises the question, can a democracy truly reflect the will of God if its foundation is based on secular, human reasoning rather than divine authority? If a democracy's will is detached from the eternal truths revealed by God, then it risks becoming an instrument of human ambition and moral relativism. The role of faith in public life. Ultimately, from a Christian ethos, true justice and governance are only realized when societies are aligned with God's will. This is why both Catholicism and Orthodoxy have historically supported a form of governance that integrates Christian teaching and moral guidance into public life. In a democratic society, the challenge for Christians is how to balance participation in a secular system with the responsibility to remain faithful to God's teachings. Saint Augustine, in his work The City of God, drew a distinction between the city of man and the city of God. The former is governed by human desires and ambition, while the latter is directed toward eternal truth and righteousness. For Christians living in democratic societies, the ultimate goal is to ensure that their participation in civic life reflects their allegiance to the city of God, advocating for policies and governance that reflect divine truth and moral order, even while navigating the imperfections of the secular world. Conclusion. To summarize, democracy, without grounding in divine truth, can become susceptible to the flaws of human nature, example oligarchy, greed, and moral relativism. Christian governance historically emphasized the divine right of rulers and the role of monarchs as stewards of God's will, in contrast to the secular foundations of many modern democratic revolutions. Catholic and Orthodox teachings stress the importance of aligning governance with God's moral order, advocating for leadership that serves the common good and divine purpose. In the context of modern secular democracies, Christians are called to navigate this tension by remaining faithful to the teachings of Christ, promoting justice, truth, and moral integrity even within a pluralistic and often morally ambiguous system. Thus, the tension that is explored between the will of the people and the will of God remains a central concern for Christians in the modern world. The challenge is to discern how to engage in civic life without compromising one's faith and to ensure that human governance always seeks to reflect God's eternal justice.